Hello, everyone. Welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis. And as always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Aramatashaloni peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who came before us as stewards of the land. Anyone who's browsed the shelves of City Lights will undoubtedly have come across books published under the imprint of New York Review Books. Their curatorial and aesthetic excellence is legendary in the trade, charting and guiding the literary life of both here in the US and abroad. Our guest tonight is none other than Edwin Frank, the editorial director of New York Review Books and founder of the NYRB Classics series. City Lights is delighted to be celebrating his new book, Stranger Than Fiction, Lives of the 20th-Century Novel. It's published by Farrar, Straus, Giroux. For those of us who love the art of the novel and care to deepen our appreciation of it, Stranger Than Fiction is essential reading. We are taken on a journey experiencing how writers have transformed the novel to address the issues of the day and reflect upon the human condition. This is the story of the power of the novel to reinvent itself. With great erudition, curiosity, and an intimacy with his subject, Edwin Frank captures this wondrous drama in all of its nuance and grandeur. Stranger Than Fiction offers us a new vision of the novel's history and art. It is an indispensable book for anyone interested in understanding the trajectory of fiction writing, from where it has come and where it could possibly go. And moreover, it's a treasure trove for any reader looking to deepen their appreciation of the novel as an art form. Edwin Frank was born in Boulder, Colorado, and educated at Harvard and Columbia Universities. He has been a Wallace Stegner Fellow and a Lannan Fellow and is a member of the New York Institute for the Humanities. He has taught in the Columbia Writing Program and served on the jury of the Booker International Prize. He is the recipient of a Lifetime Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters for distinguished service to the arts. And on top of all this, he is also a gifted poet, authoring the book Snake Train. As the editorial director of NYRB and the founder of the NYRB Classics series, he has brought into print an astounding body of work that has set the bar for excellence in publishing. So joining him tonight in conversation is none other than City Lights' own Paul Yamazaki. Paul has been the principal buyer at City Lights booksellers for more than 50 years, a champion for national and global literature, writers, publishers, and independent bookstores. He was the recipient of the National Book Foundation's 2023 Literarian Award for Outstanding Service to the American literary community. He has mentored generations of booksellers across America, myself included. His book, Reading the Room, A Bookseller's Tale, was recently published by Ode Books. So we're going to be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Stranger Than Fiction. And we're also going to be featuring a Q&A towards the end of the talk, so you may also post your questions and comments in that same chat function. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Edwin Frank and Paul Yamazaki. It is such a pleasure to have you both in the same room talking about a subject so dear to many of us. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Edwin, thank you so much for being here. I'd just like to kind of reinforce Peter's statements and actually put a more personal spin on it. I think what you have done, Edwin, for myself as a reader, myself as a bookseller, and for City Lights as an institution, and for independent bookstores around the country is what, over the 20, is it 20 years now or 25?
25.
25, which is is that it is one of the hallmarks of good independent bookstore is to see that colophon like kind of spined out or faced out throughout the store. But I think I would concur with everything that Peter said about Stranger Than Fiction, but the one thing that I would add that is also a reader's delight, your gift of language is really fun and kind of illuminating. And if you'll indulge me, just one of the lines that came out, and I would like to just, I'm not going to refer to which chapter it's in or who you're referring to as a writer, but I think for readers here, to just hear this sentence, the slippery fishbowl distortions of ordinary speech, meaning, and intent drifting in and out of sight, the mist, the wobbly weed, and shimmer of words. I've been delighting over that sentence when I first came over it. There are many more sentences like this, and it's not just that it's a delight of language, but it's also an indication of how conceptually you've kind of created this arc of what I'm going to call the long 20th century. Just that and we'll talk about maybe Hobsbawm a little bit later, and but you stated at the beginning in the introduction that you were listening to the radio, and that Radiohead and that brought you back to Alex Ross's book, and then and you thought perhaps you could do with the 20th century novel that
yeah. Well, Alex Ross, who is the classical music critic for the New Yorker, wonderful critic, had taken on what seems, frankly, in a way, a much harder job, which is to make people get excited about what is probably considered the most rebarbative of the high art forms, 20th century classical music. And he did a great job. And he did it partly by looking at his main emphasis was how that music emerged, not from it wasn't written by a brain in a vat and so on. It was written by people who were refugees, people who were using new technologies, people who were very, very responsive, who were driven this way and that by the history of the 20th century. And I found myself, Radiohead must have, Radiohead. Alex Ross is a great fan of Radiohead and done a profile of the band not long before this. This is a long time ago. This book took me a long time to write. It's nice to hear that it reads well, because it took me a long time to write it. But Alex is a fan of Radiohead, and so I'd picked up whatever CD. Well, it was a CD in those days. Time, the centuries change the thing, and put it in. Played it while I was doing the dishes, and found myself thinking, could you do that for the novel? And I thought no, because music is not exactly an international language. You have to know certain kinds of musics to appreciate them. I know that from how my parents used to scream about music that I played, and they didn't appreciate it at all. But it doesn't. It is not the same kind of language as French or or Spanish or what you will. So I thought, no, language kind of cordoned off the different literatures, and that's of course how we're taught them. They're, if they're university departments of this, that, or the other. But then I thought maybe yes. And one thing that made me think yes was that, well, the novel was an industrial form. It spread with mass literacy and mass education. As it spread, people developed an appetite for more novels, and they wanted to read novels from other places they hadn't been. Translations spread. And by the beginning of the 20th century, even before, but more and more decisively by the beginning of the 20th century, people were writing books that were inspired by books that had been written in other languages and that they had read in translation. And they were also writing books that they hoped people would read in translation. The novel was emerging from a more globalized world and was responding to that world, and helping to make it. And so that became an entry into how to tell the story of how the novel and the century got along or didn't.
So how much as you mentioned that this took a long time to write this book.
Yeah.
How much was like kind of did you have a roadmap for how you wanted to approach this, or did this evolve as you kind of continued to think and read and edit and also write?
Both. I mean, there were certain notions at the beginning, certain things that I just knew at the beginning that if I, we're going to go, if I was, that in doing this, I was going to do it this way. I knew right at the beginning that Notes from Underground would be sort of a touchstone, even though Notes from Underground is a novel from the 19th century. As I say at the beginning, Dostoevsky's writing the first 20th century novel in 1864. He doesn't know it, he never will. But that, I spent some time thinking, well, wait, that's not a 20th century novel, but a bit along the lines of your mention of Hobsbawm. The centuries are flexible things. They don't just begin at the stroke of midnight of a specific set of 100 years. And so I knew that most of what goes on in the first part of the book, which is sort of a section about breaking away from the 19th century and breaking towards something as yet unknown. Those things I mostly knew I would do. The end part, which is set between after the end of the Second World War and running up to basically the late 80s to there I was less certain. I didn't know, how is this book going to end? In a way, it's a book. Part of what I'm writing is a book about almost a fictional character, the 20th century novel, who begins wearing Edwardian garb and ends in a bomber jacket. What that end, which wasn't that far away when I began thinking about this book, would be. I was surprised by some of the books I ended up writing about. They were books I had not anticipated writing about. In some cases, books I'd not read when I began.
Well, one of the things that surprised me, it came very early, was the H.G. Wells. And so just I when I'd heard about this, I had never, if you'd asked me who was going to be in this book, I had some sense, but the one that would have never ever occurred to me was Wells. And how did that come to you? Just because you write and structured it so well, it's now very clear to me why. But I certainly.
Yeah, well, that was for me there were things I knew I would have to do. A book is something you shape, but a book is also, and especially a book of nonfiction, makes its own demands on you. But in a way that came out of the series, the classic series, and editing it, in that we have published Wells. We published Edward Gorey's illustrated version of the War of the Worlds, but one thing I've wanted to do, and I think that as this is, mix up genres, high and low, and partly because many of the outstanding writers of the mid to late century became more, nurtured themselves on forms of writing that would have perhaps been seen as not fully literary, that in a century which saw the birth of a kind of art novel, which in a way I track back to the writer who I juxtapose with Wells, André Gide, a kind of high literary novel, and in that way breaks away from a kind of 19th century novel for everybody, if you will. Genre also breaks away. Genre has its own incredibly tight and brilliant set of concerns and remakes the novel just as much as the art novel does. And in fact, I think there's a kind of back and forth between the two. So I wanted to set that up, and that meant, so I knew that I wanted to do that. I hadn't read Wells forever. And I went back sometime around the time I was doing it. Also, Vivian Gornick told me about how amazing Wells's huge autobiography, an experiment in autobiography was. And in fact, she was telling me I should republish it. And at 800 pages or something like that, I kind of balked. But I went to, anyway, the Wells, the Time Traveler, The Island of Dr. Moreau, Invisible Man, I mean, these are works of modern mythology, and the fact that they get reproduced in every single genre, every single medium imaginable at this point, movies, TV, video games, I would imagine. Well, even when he was writing, somebody wanted to turn one of these things into an amusement park. So right away, the potential was seen by people. He's a phenomenal writer and a phenomenal figure, and also somebody who joins politics together with writing in a way that arguably is new in its own right.
Well, one of the things, and you just highlighted some of that in your conversation about Wells, is that you did a lot of research and study about being able to place the writer in the novel in its context, and how then you start flowing. Your transitions are very good to just, and it's like, and so it feels very connected. It does not seem like a book of separate essays.
Yeah, no, I wanted to tell the story of I wanted to talk about these books, which are extraordinary books, which still give thought. They give thought because they have their failings as well as their brilliance. I mean, they are like people that they are. That, but I also wanted to tell a story, as I said, about how the novel was changed by the century, and also gives us, makes us think about the century that is past, and perhaps, gives us tools to think about the times to come.
So was part of kind of the length of this kind of how much reading, because you're not just reading the novels, you're reading a lot of like kind of, whether it's criticism or other kind of contextualizing text, or that's what it appears to be as a reader of this, because you give us such a full world in a really concise way of in each chapter.
Well, putting together the book was a matter of reading and newly reading and rereading this, above all, great novels from the last century. And that experience involves surprises. I thought I would want to write about Lawrence, for example, who I see as both an exception to the other writers in the book, but also is a truly extraordinary writer. But at that point, I was thinking about this. Most of what I'd read of Lawrence's for a long time had been his poetry, which is also very, very great. I mean, he's a wonderful, wonderful poet. And I was a little anxious, having kind of sketched in, making a proposal. That itself took God knows how long for the book. Horrible thing to have to write book proposals. But I thought, going back to Lawrence, maybe I had misremembered. I had misremembered. I remembered reading Sons and Lovers. I thought I'd probably be writing about women in love, which I don't really write about. Sons and Lovers, and thinking, I must have read it when I was a teenager, and with all my teenage wisdom, I already condescended to this description of a teenager, which is what the book is mostly about. It's a great book. I mean, I finished it floored, in the sense that it is an extraordinarily courageous book. It's a beautifully written book. It's a book where the writing you feel the writing on your pulse. It's just a phenomenal book. And so that was, it was a surprise and a happy one. So anyway, there was also the question of support of secondary sources. My primary interest was, these aren't really secondary sources, they're just a secondary level of primary sources, journals, letters. I turned to Virginia Woolf's journals a good deal. Virginia Woolf's journals are phenomenal. In a way, I think they're the single greatest thing she ever wrote. They are, her writing is just absolutely off the cuff. Her malice, which was extensive, is very evident, but but her seriousness is there too, and the mix of just the sense of, like as Whitman says about Leaves of Grass, who touches this book touches a man. Well, this is true of Virginia Woolf's, just phenomenal journals. A great something, I had not really read it extensively before I did this. Finally, there's, histories. I read a lot of history, a lot of histories. I knew that this was not going to be a book of, discovering new historical points. My historical touchstones are the ones that are the established historical touchstones, though perhaps I would be able to say things about how these books really, it was important to the notion of the book that how these books connected to those moments, and perhaps might make us think twice about them. Criticism least. I have, I've a lifetime of reading books and publishing books, and sometime in graduate school, though I was doing art history, means I've read a fair amount of criticism. But really the critics who for me were exemplars were people, people like Pauline Kael, who had to write week after week to make people think about what I call descriptive criticism, to make people, to make a book come alive enough that you'd want to go and read it, to make a movie come alive enough that you want to go see it.
So you mentioned kind of like how difficult it was to write a proposal, but you're writing that to Alex Starr, who is I think one of those editors that I look to when I see a book of nonfiction and I see Alex's name attached to it. That's automatically going onto the shelves of City Lights. And so, so what was that process for you to kind of like, one, being an editor yourself, and also to work with somebody like Alex and to like, just it's.
Well, that was a great experience, actually. And Alex actually, inherited the book, as it were, so he wasn't signed up to do it to begin with. And we began to work with, given how long it took me to write, quite a while ago. And so there was quite a while where we worked together. And I had gone through, I'd never written anything like this. And in fact, had never imagined I would write anything like this. And there were points where I thought along the way, why in God's name did they ask somebody who's written poetry and written the occasional essay and written a lot of jacket copy and tried to do the jacket copy as, not just to actually make it informative rather than, but really has not written a book about the 20th century novel or anything remotely like it. And there was a period where it was, as with any book, a period where I was trying to figure out how to write this book. On my own, chiefly. The first chapter or the prologue about Dostoevsky, I did, I'd read for 3 or 4 years. I sat down to write it, and I figured out, it maybe took me 6, 7 weeks to write it, and I thought, I've solved all my problems. And now I just, it's going to go one book after another. But what we were just talking about, as I said, I wanted in a way to set up a complementary contrast between Gide founding high art fiction and Wells doing genre fiction, the popular and the highbrow. I wanted to do that as one chapter. It took me an insanely long time to realize that if you take the strands that in a chapter I do try to mix all through the book, some of biography, some of history, some of literary history and criticism, as well as actually talking enough about the book that the reader has a sense of what kind of book it is. That if you did that with 2 authors, you had a fugue with so many voices that it just wandered off into it was like straying sheep. And it must have taken me a whole year to realize that this is a very simple mechanical kind of formal question. And then at some point, pounding my head against the wall, I said, oh, right, I have to make this into 2 chapters. And I have to find links between chapters. And it's something like that will get me through. And there were further such experiences. I lost a chapter about Conrad, who which in a way I regret entirely, but that was a chapter I did not know how to lose things yet. And so I ended up finally losing the whole chapter because I just I was too traumatized by it really to keep trying to do it, and I had to move on. And by the time I'd moved on, there wasn't a reason to really. There was a reason to bring it back, but the book had become big, and the book had taken on its own life at that point.
You have mentioned in other conversations, but was there a moment, was there a breakage in terms of the former, like through a large part of the 20th century novel, that there was a lot of formal invention? And was there at a time that where people thought the formal invention is not as important as just trying to realize whatever that particular author's vision was, and that they weren't necessarily trying to create that next kind of formal or transgressive work?
Well, I mean, I think looking at the novels at the beginning of the century, I don't think there's a lot of literary self-consciousness about that. I think that books that may seem to us, very innovative and transgressive and still difficult to absorb, like the classic example is Ulysses, um, came out of a kind of both of the things you say, a sense that Joyce had to find his way to speak for himself, and he wasn't trying to impress anybody with it. It was just an urgent matter of he was a writer, and to be a writer was to write the thing that you had in you to write. And but equally, it emerges from that fascinating late 19th into early 20th century moment where the novel is really an experimental instrument to try and take the measure of how we know the world and what the world looks like. And figuring out how to do that is an all-consuming passion for somebody like Gertrude Stein, equally for somebody like Joyce, and equally, I write about how Woolf really disliked Ulysses, but she shared that passion for figuring out who she was and what the book would be and how it could open up the world. I mean, a curious thing that is more or less present in these authors is the sense of, is opening up the world going to really change the world and make it a better world? I think for Virginia Woolf, that is really a kind of there is a kind of almost what you might almost think of a Victorian conviction that good writing is a good deed. It shouldn't be a simple-minded good deed. It shouldn't be for other writers like the implacable Jean Rhys. I think she just wants to be herself on the page, and as unapologetically as possible. Yeah.
So you mentioned Woolf and mentioning her journals, which, if I understand correctly, most are now out of print. There used to be those wonderful editions that Harcourt did of the Leonard and Virginia's letters, and which are also out of print. And is that something
Yeah.
they're bringing
Well, I
back?
hear that Granta has done some sort of new edition in England. I can't quite. I haven't seen the book, so But yeah, I had to buy all this stuff on print on demand. They were certainly not, I mean, the journals went through various incarnations. Leonard Woolf published what was it called, a writer's diary or something like that, which is, in many ways, and this is not in any way uh, in many ways um, well, it's not only abridged, but it is also Bowdlerized in a way. It's not, it keeps, many people were still alive, et cetera, et cetera. As I said, she has a considerable malice and chattiness and so on. So, and that was the kind of, a bit like, the Virginia Woolf version of Rilke's letters to a young poet. And then these other things came out in this, I think mainly in the 70s, and they're brilliantly annotated and yeah, I mean, everybody should go buy print-on-demand versions of the different volumes of her journals. They are a great life story. As the other, totally different in a way, but also really important book that I use and talk about a good deal is André Gide's journals, which were a touchstone back in the day to poets, and back in the day, meaning before I was born in the 1950s, to poets like Robert Creeley and so on, because Gide was kind of the epitome of a 20th century cosmopolitan sensibility. And those are journals that were very carefully constructed for publication, and even before he died, were brought out in the plan. And I wonder, I would assume, I don't know actually whether in French now they are being published in whatever form they were before he massaged them, or whether he, didn't leave them in that form, which is also a possibility.
Recall who did the translations for the Knopf editions of those journals?
Justin O'Brien. Yeah. We can probably both remember the day when the 4 volumes of those used to be available in vintage books, and yeah, yeah.
And then I was considering them because this was about maybe 20 years ago. There was all 4 volumes like at the Strand in relatively good shape. And
yeah, right. You can still find those old vintage books from the yeah.
So how does this all intersect in terms of like, just what you've done, the extraordinary work that you've done over a quarter century of bringing these books back to life? As a bookseller and as a reader, it's kind of, when you go, but how many books? 750,000?
700 some, I think we're at. How we got there, I don't know. But anyway, that.
But whether it's like, the Grossmans or the Don Carpenter or the Renata Ottlers or the Eve Babbitts more recently, I mean, not only are booksellers delighted, but readers are delighted. And so like, how do all these kind of activities that you do on a daily basis kind of like help shape and sustain you in terms of the writing this book that you had never done anything quite like this before?
Well, I don't think I would have thought to do a book like this if it hadn't been for for my job. And as I think I may have said, I spent time in graduate school, though in art history. I'd studied English literature as an undergraduate. I didn't have any desire to, at a certain point in my life, in the middle of my life, lost a dark wood, I realized I had been, I didn't want to do anything. I did not want to be an academic, with no prejudice against the wonderful and extraordinary things that academics do indeed do, but that I didn't want to be one. But I did want to go on thinking about books and art. These had shaped my life up to then in all sorts of ways. And frankly, being involved in publishing, not only choosing books, but frankly, being involved in a kind of business and thinking about uh, how people read books and how you can get books to get a certain kind of purchase in the world, and not just not just be forgotten, but actually give them a chance to meet the readers that they should have. All of this experience feeds into the book. I mean, it is a book about great books. It's a book about what it means to be a great book. It's a book about, to some extent, the last century, in the particular form, a kind of book the novel took in that. But it is also a book about how books attach themselves to the common world in which we all live, which is a world which is something that publishers and booksellers try to make sure a kind of back and forth, the kind that we all are trying to make happen. So that experience, without that experience, when it came to writing an academic thesis, I just could feel entirely bored. When it came to writing this, it seemed to me part of a living in the world that everybody, people who write books, people who read books, people who sell books, people who publish books, are in some sense trying to think about how books live in the world and how one lives in relation to books. And so this was my way of trying to give that some sort of shape.
Well, in the world of books, and I think one of the things that really intrigued me about your biography is that maybe this project starts with your involvement with the Reader's Catalog and like kind of Jason's Epstein's kind of amazing kind of pre-internet vision of trying to like kind of summarize what should be in print.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it starts well before that, when I'm a teenager going to bookstores and picking up books like, I mean, I happened to, the books that were in Vintage Books that Jason edited started to begin with, the books that were in Anchor Books, and also the great Penguin Modern Classics of the 50s and of the 60s and 70s, as well as Penguin Classics, when all book programs that were looking back and forth in time and addressed at the general reader, and which included a very young reader like me who could sit around and not eat and get something other than the school lunch and pocket the extra money in order to buy to buy one of the books from the list of books that I had made by going to the local bookstore and thinking about, this looks like an interesting book, or what's that book going to be about, and so on. So it was, in a way, amazing, providential, that I ended up involved with this enterprise of Jason's, the Reader's Catalog, which was an effort to recreate a kind of, sort of Sears catalog that was going to compensate for the disappearance. So at that point, when he started it in the late 80s, of the independent bookstore across such swaths of America, and was to give people a kind of a way of imagining what's out there.
Well, if anybody finds the Reader's Catalog, it's like the capsule descriptions are there. Many of them are extremely well written, and did you contribute to that?
I did. No, that was my first job, was editing. I was supposed to point out what was missing, which is what made the series come into existence, in that so many things that I thought, or a lot of things I thought were good, were missing. But yes, I was overseeing some of the copy and so on, and contributing a good deal of it too. So,
well, I know Peter has it in his collection somewhere where I can't actually identify where it is in my collection right now, but I do have a copy of the Reader's Catalog.
Well, we can get you one.
But so you're pretty consciously see yourselves in that tradition of Alan Lane and Ian Ballantyne and the Signet classics, and like, of course, like, with like the Torch and
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, frankly, very straightforwardly, I saw myself as partly, as an editor, recreating those series which had been everywhere when I was a kid, and the Signet classics, when Dr. O and Toni Morrison were working on them, and they were getting people like James Wright to translate. This is a book I've reprinted. The great late 19th century German writer Theodor Storm's Rider on the White Horse, a book that I picked up at a used bookstore. I'd never read it. I hadn't, and I don't know what it was, winter, it was New York. I went and took a bath and thought I'd read this book about a man, a dike maker. And so I thought, we can never really publish this book. By the time I'd finished the novella, I thought we just have to. And I can't say it's one of our best sellers, but it should be a better seller. It's a great book.
Well, to me, it's so inspiring to hear you just based off of your impressions as a reader and knowing and trusting that there'll be others of us out there who will respond in ways maybe similar to you. That I think one of the things that the New York Review of Books and City Lights shares in common is that trust in the reader, and and I think one of the benefits that Peter and I have being booksellers is that we are rewarded on a continual basis by the delight and excitement that readers have, but that's the excitement and that actually belongs to you and the writers, but we're the ones who actually are at that phase of interchange, and so we're the ones who receive it. But it's a tremendously heartening to see the response to that, and and these books grow over time. It's like, and I am not involved in social media in any form, but I can tell just by looking at that somehow books start to enter the conversation, and then it's
yeah. Well, I'm also not involved in social media, though. Of course, my colleague, among my colleagues, people are, and so on. But it is interesting to see how, new discussions start and old discussions pick up again, and the ways people think about things change too.
But you couldn't have the discussion if the book doesn't exist, and
there's that. Yeah, right.
You made it possible to have that book on the shelves, and it's so I thank you so much for that. I know one of my favorite things is like when I go to community books in Brooklyn, for example, and to see kind of they have that for a long-standing section that's just New York Review books of classics, and it's and now Stranger in Fiction is going to join that, and I think it's going to be so rewarding to readers. And I think it's one of the things that I've noted in that you work very hard, or there is no jargon in your book. It is kind of like, as I pointed out earlier, the beauty of language and thought combined, and so was that really deliberate on your part? Like, I don't think the word postmodernism appears. Maybe.
Yeah, well, certainly not doing modernism and postmodernism. That was a basic, a starting discussion, a starting decision. I mean, I wanted to put, among other things, the books that are called modernist, not in terms of somehow, they arrived at a modernist aesthetic, whatever that might be, or something. I wanted to see them as books that people, that came out of the lived experience of the moment, rather than being some sort of aesthetic project as such. Otherwise, yes, I worked very hard not to use jargon, not to write like an academic, to write, I hope, in a voice of my own. I wanted this to be a book that felt like you were in something like a conversation, or hearing the thoughts or ways of thinking and thinking again about things that call on us to think and think again about them. It's not like I'm out to say that this book is about this and that's what you need to know about this book. This book is alive and out there in the world, and it asks you, there are good reasons why it's worth your while to read it, and once you read it, it opens a whole new set of questions and a whole new set of visions, and so on.
I can say, as a reader and as a bookseller, you were immensely successful in doing that. I mean, it's such an engaging book. I guess it's appropriate to start to wind down. This is like, I would imagine concluding this book and to find which book, which author that you wanted to kind of complete this arc, and like what was that process like for you? Or was that something that was really clear and that you knew that you wanted to, that
I
this would?
think I knew I would end with Naipaul's Enigma of Arrival, perhaps simply as a kind of hunch that a book called The Enigma of Arrival is a good book to end to put at the end of a book. But several of the books that I ended up talking about as you approach the end, Perec's Life's a User's Manual, Yourcenar's Memoirs of Hadrian, were books that I certainly had not made up my mind to write about. And in fact, Elsa Morante's History is a book I had not read, though I had long wanted to write. But I mean, it made sense, read, excuse me. It made sense because one of the themes of the last part of the book is retrospection. Many of these books from Lolita and so on, even as they are very innovative and brilliant in their own right, are books that are very conscious of their precursors of their 20th century precursors. I mean, Nabokov knows his Proust, knows his Joyce. He knows that those are about the only writers he thinks are as good as he is. So that, the novel turning back on a century that both has an established tragic history, and though these are books written in a period of in the post-war era, which is one of relative prosperity and peace. So all of that was there. The Naipaul surprised me in a way, in that I did not I hadn't read it for a long time, and when I went back to it, the fact that his looking at the De Chirico painting that gives him his title, and the way he reads that painting is, in effect, takes us back, as I say at the end, to Kafka. And so there is a way in which you have reached the end, but you are back at the beginning. And that pleased me and pleased my sense of form as well.
It was very elegant, and I thank you. I can see that Peter's out here. Peter, do you have some questions from?
Indeed, we've started.
I am going to inelegantly say, may I take a bathroom break before we take the question?
Of course.
Okay, thank you.
Of course, yeah. So everyone, yes, this is your chance to post questions, comments, anything you would like. And yeah, that reader's catalog was just magnificent. And also just sometimes to, randomly open to any page.
Oh, that's
which to me was like one of the most fun parts about it.
I mean, for folks out there who haven't seen, this was the size of a traditional old yellow pages. It was about the same trim size, and it was like I don't know, 600, 700 pages.
Massive. Yeah, absolutely massive. Good doorstop.
Again, thank you for your tolerance.
Sure. So let's see. Yes, the questions have started to roll in. Carol Harden. Hello to you, Edwin, from your old stomping grounds of Boston. Kudos to you on your book. I wish you and it every deserved success. Let's see. Who else do we have here? We have Stephen Sparks from Point Reyes Books is in the audience. Nice, Edwin, Steve. Do you subscribe to the idea of major or minor writers? If so, how would you classify the difference between them?
Oh, I mean, yes, at some level, there are writers who go on. I mean, it's almost a matter of happenstance. So I don't, they're the writers who get taught in school all the time. And some of those, and simply by virtue of being taught in school, they're major until some people say, wait, are they? And so, I mean, I think it's more a question of asking how meaningful yes, there are writers who are at various points more meaningful than other writers and whose works seem to be really to set the tone and seem to be inescapable. Sometimes, and those writers come and go, and some of them last for longer, and some of them last for a very long time indeed. I mean, it's a little, I mean, what do we mean now? I mean, I would buy that, Aeschylus is a major writer. On the other hand, does Aeschylus have a major influence on people these days? Probably not, I mean so I guess that I'd say that the distinction exists, but it exists mainly as a kind of a way of exploring uh, what majorly matters to us about writing at a given moment or another.
Let's see. Justin asks, how does NYRB Classics decide to no longer publish one of their classics, such as the Simenon or the Julio Cortázar?
They get taken away from us because the estate sells them to another publisher. The Simenon, I mean, the Simenon backlist went to Penguin, and that I worked hard that would not happen, but I was unsuccessful. The Cortázar is a slightly, how did that happen exactly? Cortázar was that's a wonderful book, The Winners, and somebody should put it in print. And the person who should put it in print is Penguin Random House, who continue to have most of the rights to Cortázar's backlist, even though many of those books are out of print. But it's an interesting feature of publishing. Cortázar is a difficult and wonderful writer who is known chiefly for one of the wonderful books, a book I did think about writing about, and probably even did write about to some extent, Hopscotch. But it is a fact of publishing that if you take a lesser known book by such a writer, the number of people who graduate from the book that is effectively the canonical one to the lesser known one is vanishingly small. And some issue of publishing business came up and the book slipped our hands, but it was a learning experience, because that was one of the first books we did, and I thought everybody would be out there wanting to see The Winners, but the best The Winners could do is probably get other people to read the Hopscotch, which is good. That was in its own right a good thing.
James asks, oh yes, the Reader's Catalog. How or where do we find a copy of the Reader's Catalog? All I'm seeing online is at NYRB are under the title that are being gifts. Are there new editions being published at all from time to time, or somebody else?
Well, you have to understand the Reader's Catalog was a sales instrument. It was a catalog like the Sears catalog. So, and the way I got involved, it was the so-called 40,000 best books in print. That means it was, it was only relevant at the point when it was published. And indeed, for many years, or for some years, not that many now, one of the things that I worked at was continually updating it and overseeing updating it online, so that it would continue to be a book of books in print. But again, the classic series arose from the fact that many of the best books were not in print at that point. And so hence our desire to put them in print. Anyway, the Reader's Catalog as that kind of enterprise has not existed now for 25 years. I don't know if there were two editions of it, a first and second. The second was the one I got involved with that came out in 96. Whether quite a number of those books were printed, there must be some floating out there. It is a fun book to browse, and it is a picture of what a big bookstore would have been in 1996, a big good bookstore.
Let's see. Another question. Have you, by any chance, had the opportunity to examine the new book about Joan Didion and Eve Babbitt's? Any comments?
I have not, and I should say that Eve Babbitt's is my colleague Sarah Kramer's author, and not to distance myself from Eve Babbitt's. I enjoy Eve Babbitt's as much as anybody. Um, so I think it's fascinating, and I think that there is a book looking at the two of them. It would not have been. I mean, when I started doing this, and Sarah and I have been doing this together from the beginning. Joan Didion was a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, and Eve Babbitt's was somebody that neither one of us, and frankly, neither one of us had heard of. And so it's been a pleasure to bring her back into this larger conversation about American writing and in the latter half of in the last century and this century.
I have a question actually. How did you get into graphic novels, and how do you curate? How do you choose what you accept, and what do you look for
in the graphic novels, or just in general?
In the graphic novels, yeah.
So I am in no graphic. No, I don't really read graphic novels and don't really know how to read graphic novels. A colleague who was working in production, Lucas Adams, who is the editor of the series now, came to me with a colleague who was working at the paper, Gabe Winslow Yost, and they had a proposal for the comic series based in some sense on what the Classics was doing, mixing old and new. I thought it was a great idea. I liked the idea that they were going to do, comic strips together with graphic novels, together with really very inventive that they would be looking to the past as well as looking to the present. All of that was everything that I've hoped the series would do, and our other publications, like the Poets series, which I was very happy to bring into existence at a certain point, combining new writing with old writing and talking about that interrelation. I've been happy to see it take flight, and Lucas is the brains behind it, and has done a spectacular job.
Will we be seeing any more poetry from you?
From me?
Yes.
Yeah, I hope so. I just the other day finished a poem which I'm contributing to an artist abecedary, an artist's alphabet, with other poets and so on. And I hadn't finished a poem for a long time. There were jottings piling up, but I had this book to finish. I hope to get back to poetry. Yep.
Yeah. Great.
Just to kind of piggyback on Peter, and this is very selfish on my part, is like, are you contemplating, as well as more poetry, more kind of works like Stranger Than Fiction, or what are you thinking about next as a writer?
Well, I don't know. I'm thinking about it, and I'd like to get back to poetry. And then I was thinking about a book, maybe about what it means to actually read things, which not in the sense of making sense of things, not even in the sense I've done it here, but but how it is everybody is all worked up about AI. One thing AI can't do is it can't really read a book. It can scrape information, but it can't have the experience of reading a book. And what is that experience exactly?
Well, I hope you kind of pursue that project. It's a book I would love to read.
And as we find ourselves at the top of the hour, Edwin Frank, it was such an honor to have you with us, and especially talking about a subject that's really filled with such meaning and joy for us here at City Lights. And really, thank you for gracing our virtual halls. I mean, it was a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much. What a great bookstore, anyway, I'm really honored and delighted for this evening.
Well, I look forward to
thank you for doing the honors.
Pardon, Peter?
Thank you for doing the honors, sir.
It's totally my pleasure and privilege. But I just wanted to say to Edwin, my form of social media is a bar stool, and I'm hoping to do that with you sometime in the not too distant future.
Looking forward to it. All right.
Thank you so much.